look, thank you very much for the introduction. I want to get started actually by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land upon which we are all meeting, and I assume that you've already done this, but I think it's important that I do so too. I'm standing on the land of Indigenous people up here in Meanjin, Brisbane, and this was land that was never ceded by First Nations people. So again, I appreciate the introduction you gave me. At the outset, what I want to say about my presentation is really based on anecdotal evidence received in my role as an officer of the union. I've been working for the QTU since 2007. It's really based on conversations that have been had with various educational leaders and teachers across the state in my time. And more recently, when I got asked to do this, I spoke to some people, some principals from our educational leaders group. So I know I've got a master's, as was said before, I've got a master's of business research, but, and from way back, a long time ago, 2010, I'm acutely aware of the rigours normally applied to research and whatever. So this is absolutely not applied here. It is completely anecdotal, but I think there is a great value in offering the perspectives of those practitioners on the ground. So I think that's really important. So to kick off my thinking about this, I had to look more broadly, and I wanted to look at, well, what are the broader sort of educational goals in utopia? And I know we're not working in utopia in terms of education, far from it, but you know, what are the goals for students? What do we want? We want them to have a great education, benefit from a broad, well-developed curriculum, etc. We want teachers and educational leaders to be supported to deliver that and be valued and have professional autonomy. Members of society then in our utopia are well educated and successfully contribute, and as a society as a whole, we are well-rounded, well-educated citizens participating well. Now, I don't want to overplay my hand here. I'm not suggesting that out-of-field teaching is the cause of all our woes, but it does have a significant impact and has been the subject, as you know, of research around the world. We know that out-of-field teaching has been a concern across the world for decades, and we know that a society that values education really does invest in it. It's my view, personal view, that perhaps that's not really evident as much as it needs to be in this country, particularly, you know, early childhood program schools, training like TAFE, university sectors. So out-of-field teaching impacts on students. It potentially compromises outcomes for them. It impacts on teachers, the stress and anxiety and the intensification of workload. It's also, unfortunately, a catalyst for considering leaving the profession. Importantly for educational leaders, it's all of the above, but they're the ones supporting everyone. They're supporting their kids, they're supporting the teachers, they're supporting the families. What does it do for society? It really compromises those outcomes we were talking about before. So I want to start with a story about Ruby. And Ruby, actually, I've got to put it out there, is in fact my daughter. So she started teaching last year. She has a master's in secondary teaching in English and history. And this was me when I went up to visit her about 2 months after she started teaching. She's still smiling in that photo. So that's great. So it was COVID year, as you all know. And she, as you know, English and history is where she's should be teaching. She actually did an archaeology degree before that. So in that first year, she was teaching hospitality and tourism and geography. And she was also teaching ancient history. And obviously she can teach ancient history, but there was no one else at her school with any ancient history background. So she was having to write the internal assessment pieces for the QCAA for the alternative sequence in year 11 and 12 when you've got a multi-age on her own without any backup and support. So how did this get managed? Well, the school provided all the support for Ruby. Basically, they gave her a line off. So most teachers have 5 lines in a high school, 3 classes per line. So at the school's cost, they took her off a line, and they had 2 or 3 other graduates. So they all got a line less to try to manage the workload. But it was at the cost of the school. They had to find, in essence, 0.6 for the teacher FTE. There was no dedicated funding pot put aside for this. So it was really reliant on the school to do it. And some schools do that really, really well, and some schools don't. And not because they don't want to, they might have different decisions around money. They might need to get an extra guide because they've got significant issues with disadvantage in their schools, or they need more SEP support. So, you know, what are the pressures that school leaders face when dealing with the sorts of things that Ruby was dealing with? And I guess the implications for them and the whole community are quite significant. So I will talk about that and the school improvement policy approaches, but I'm going to probably focus most on the first issue that's outlined there, on principal issues. And what I've done here is I've divided it into a few different areas: general issues for principals, staffing matters, broader issues, and miscellaneous. And then I'll go into detail about each of these. So in terms of principal issues more generally, the issues that exist for them are completely uneven. There are principals with lots of experience dealing with this and principals with no experience dealing with it. What a city school deals with is very different to a country school, and primary versus secondary. The allocative model, for example, that's the staffing model, how many teachers, how many teacher aides, etc., that you get, cuts out at 1,800. So if you're a principal managing 3,000, like down in Varsity Lakes or up at North Lakes here in Brizzy, you are dealing, you've got the same number of middle management in 1,800 as you would at 3,000. And so all of the pressures that you have with more and more kids is not able to be managed as effectively. Small schools also, and primary schools have very different staffing models and less support. So newly appointed principals deal with this more significantly, have more problems dealing with this, because generally rural and remote principals are the newly appointed ones and they've got less experience. So as a general issue for principals, it is uneven in terms of how they manage it and how their capacity to deal with it. In terms of what staffing matters need to be considered, basically knowing your staff is essential. This is a tension if you're a newly appointed principal, because you might be in a country school where staff change all the time. So you might actually know your staff and then a stack of them move on. So, or you might only have a couple of staff to select from. You really need to know their strengths and weaknesses, and you need to know how to develop the capacity and where you're going to get that from. And there's a lot of work and thinking that needs to go into that. Managing the resistance or the willingness for people. You know, some people might have some previous work experience, or they might have a talent in something, or they might have an interest in it. They might have a loose connection to the subject or whatever, but they have to also be willing. And it's a challenge significantly for our principals to do that, particularly in our areas where they're having to ask people in a lot of instances to work outside of their field of expertise. The PD and the cost of that, the consideration of the years of experience that someone has and what is reasonable. Staff stress and burnout levels are also really problematic for our principals looking at this issue. So what are the broader HR matters? And these are not insignificant also, because this doesn't happen in a vacuum. It happens in an incredibly dynamic, constantly changing place. So the staff shortages are statewide, but they play out differently in different regions, different locations. Rural and remote is very different again, and also in different subject areas. And as we all know, STEM subjects are significantly problematic, well, certainly here up in Queensland. The industrial conditions that teachers are employed under need to be considered when you're looking at this, because first year teachers, for example, get extra non-contact time and are under probation. So is it fair to ask someone who's in their probationary year to teach outside of the area that they would normally have, you know, got their experience in when they were before they graduated? The non-contact time arrangements, any leave on rehab that people might be under, might be experiencing. So you might have teachers who are going on maternity leave or long service leave, and rehab coming back in and try to provide support for it. So
Lynn, just letting you, that's your 10-minute call.
Thank you very much.
10 minutes to go.
Thank you. So the loss of mentoring support monies in Queensland, we had a really fabulous mentoring program that we got in a certified agreement a few years ago. The department has now decided to fund that, and we're in dispute with them about it. They've decided to cut the funding in a very significant way that affects how it rolls out. Workplace health and safety implications for prac subjects need to be considered when out of field teaching. So in industrial technology and design, for example, and hospitality, there are some training that needs to be undertaken to enable them to do that safely. And that can be problematic in terms of accessing it. Class size regulations, transfer system implications, supervisory arrangements, all of this goes into how do I manage this, and the competition for in-demand staff around the state. And if you get an opportunity to read our journal, Kate Rudderman, who's our General Secretary, outlines what this means for school principals, the time that they spend trying to attract staff in those out-of-field teaching areas. So retention of staff is a huge issue. So there's some miscellaneous issues. I'll go through these ones quickly. There's systemic demands. As you know, there's a new Australian curriculum that is now potentially in the offing in the next couple of years. The introduction of new departmental policies, and in Queensland, we've got a new what's called P-12 curriculum and reporting framework. All of that has impacts on people working in out of field, legal issues that teachers deal with, IT challenges that they experience, communication with parents. So these are just a whole range of miscellaneous random things that a couple principals sent back to me. The tyranny of distance and isolation and vulnerable staff. So resourcing is another issue, and this, I guess, reiterates what I've said before. PD, release time, liaising within a cluster and how to do that, using our teacher learning centres in Queensland and the Centres for Learning and Wellbeing that aren't necessarily funded to provide out-of-field teaching support, or how to manage mentoring. So in summing up, and I am going to move on to the answers in a moment, some of the solutions, but in summing up, it's basically many, varied and complex in terms of the problems for our principals and the impacts it has on the communities. It's long-standing and it's under-resourced. The implications on staff are about health and wellbeing, certainly on school communities, and the flow on to students in terms of their outcomes and the parents' trust in the system, the retention of staff and the attraction, and I guess as per our first slides, those impacts on our society. So how can school improvement policy coordinate it and identify the approaches and resolve this? How can system level leadership do that? Well, I guess to bastardize an old adage, it's the politics, stupid. Basically, if as a society we value education, we need to let our political leaders know that this is an important issue and they've got to address it. It's only when they're on board will there be the money, importantly, the energy, the time and the will able to resolve the issues meaningfully and with an intent to do that for the long term. In the meantime, for those within the system, we have to create band-aid solutions. We all need to therefore be absolutely active in our democratic system and lobby hard to have the issue supported with money. So broadly, what are the approaches? At number one, you've got to have people at the centre of this. The policy has to have people at the centre. It can't just be policy for policy's sake. It's got to be proactive. It's got to have timely, it's got to be done in a timely way. And that means as a matter of urgency. Evidence-based, we need solutions focused. We need to invest for the long term. We need to involve people who are other stakeholders in this. And this should be a joint, interstate education departments and unions and universities and professional associations and teachers. In Queensland, our Queensland Curriculum and Assessment Authority, the College of Teachers that we have here, education leaders, educational ministers around the country need to have this as the most important part on their educational agenda and start to do something about it. So to start, where do we start? Importantly, talk to principals and teachers. They usually have some pretty innovative ideas around how to resolve it. Acknowledge the magnitude of the problem, because it is, I'm going to be a bit blunt here, pretty bloody huge. Go beyond the local solutions approach and recognise it can't be up to each school to fix the issue locally. Over the last few years, there's been a solution, particularly in Queensland, around this, local solutions in local schools. And that's great. In many instances, that is a good thing for schools to be able to respond to their local context. However, this is not a local problem. It's actually a national problem and a systemic one. So you shouldn't have a local solution and expect a principal to fix that matter. Consider the weakest link and work back to plug that hole. Anything is only as strong as its weakest link. And all schools are not the same and do not have the same capacity to manage the problem. So create a systemic response to this issue and not expect, you know, a school to do it or a principal to do it. So at a systemic level, however, while the long-term solutions are developed, you need to roll out some short-term solutions that involve alternative staffing models and dedicated resourcing, and don't ask the school to find the answer. So where we come in as a union, really importantly, recognition of incentives to attract people. So rural incentive schemes that we've got in Queensland need to be improved. Housing in rural and remote areas. Money, pay them more if they're going to be doing work in those communities where they're going to be teaching out of field. Scholarships that have grit and encourage them to go out and work in out of field areas and get that experience. Differentiated approach to non-contact and PD for teachers working, mentoring, very importantly, curriculum development support, and extra release time for them. So we need to research the shortages and develop policy responses, in particularly university courses, in my view, that respond and give teachers a better understanding that they're not necessarily going to be going into what they know, and that they have some, I guess, some tools in their toolbox that help them with this. So build this into general teacher training units. Set up expectations related to the system in pre-service teachers, and indeed, the system needs to set up expectations with their employees around how they're going to support them to be able to do this long term. Develop internship models, as I said before. So National Education Council needs to address this.
Last 2 minutes, thanks, Lynn.
Thank you. All education ministers across the country have to have this on the top of their agenda. We need to gather this data quickly. Each state, each sector, other countries' data needs to be looked at, how they might have resolved it, the good, the bad, and the interesting. We need to dive deeply into that. I hate that expression, but it's the only one I could think of. We need to dive deeply into that data and plan some short-term, some medium-term, and some long-term solutions. Have a differentiated approach. Rural, remote, disadvantaged kids, First Nations peoples and communities, state versus private. In Southeast Queensland, we've got different subject shortages to other areas. So have a differentiated approach. Build a review process and be committed to resolving this in an ongoing manner. So why is this worth doing? It's worth doing for a whole range of reasons. That all of us are doing this because we're dedicated to education and we want that utopian version of education, but primarily we do it for these guys. It's absolutely about making sure that they get access to a world-class education and can meaningfully contribute to society in a way that you know, is good for them and good for everyone. So that's it. Thanks very much for your time. I appreciate you listening.